Hello, Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files, here with a bit of a new setup. Thought you folks might appreciate this. And I am speaking to a very fascinating guest. I am speaking to Matt Ehret, the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and director at Rising Tide Foundation. So, Mr. Ehret, thanks for speaking to the Canada Files.
It's a great pleasure, Aiden. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Certainly. So now we're talking in the circumstances with the threats of this annexation being made by Trump, very much an imperialist American president. All right. Now, it's produced a situation where Canadians are starting to realize that we need to turn to the rest of the world. We really need to, we could engage, we could integrate with our neighbors down south if we could, but right now that's a very tough situation for that. So we're looking to the world as Canadians. And so who better to speak to than someone who's done a very long, extensive report on what Canadian future in a multipolar world economically could look like, how things could be tapped for a better development of the economy. So, I'm going to start this now. As part of hypothetical Canadian cooperation with Russia and China, where are the zones in Canada that could be sustainably and responsibly tapped to drive a return to industrial development and a move away from over-reliance on resource extraction?
Yeah, that's a perfectly good starting point. The thing that I think people who might want a little bit more than what our conversation is going to go through, I'd recommend that they check out a new report that I'm going to draw from some of the material that I just published in a new report for citizens and policymakers called Canada and the Potential Eurasian Future. Which is called subtitled Blueprint for the 21st Century and Beyond. Now, this was a reiteration of something that I'd originally put out in 2015 called Why Canada Must Join the New Silk Road. So it was updated a few times, but the in my analysis, the point that draws upon an answer most concretely to that question is the Arctic. And I think on a multitude of levels, the Arctic is a battlefront that not enough people fully appreciate the strategic value of, both in terms of a zone which is already been decided upon that it will be a zone either of a major world conflict. There's a lot of push to militarize the Arctic in preparation for a confrontation. I'm sure we could talk about that later. Or it could be a zone of cooperation. And the amount of potentials as far as creating or regaining a sense of genuine, authentic nation building, like not just going into an area of the terrain to extract a mineral or resource to turn it into money, which has been the trend of neoliberalism for under globalization for, I don't know, I could say 50 years, probably a bit more, but the idea which I'm trying to reflect is sort of a modernized version of a pro-industrial, genuine nation-building strategy that we once had more firmly in grasp under the days of people like Clarence Decatur Howe, the Minister of Everything, John Diefenbaker, W.A.C. Bennett. And we have to go back before you and I were even born to sort of get a sense of this paradigm, even though it had its problems. It was something that was still based on the idea that the value you can create that you generate is not tied to the money or speculative markets, but what are you building for the future in some degree or another. There has to be something measurably productive that's being generated, and that's associated with also conjunction of the sovereign nation state playing a role, as well as creating an environment for the private sector to blossom and to play a useful role in building up rail and building up new industries, new infrastructure corridors. And we just lost that. I mean, it was really, I would say, with JFK's murder, we really let go of that paradigm and that spirit. So I think when I look at what makes Eurasia viable and why there is such an effort to demonize Russia, especially China, amongst intelligence agencies that control both left and right uh, consumer press agencies, the reason why is because these nations are they've picked up the torch and they're actually generating long-term, large-scale mega projects that both benefit the private sector as well as the individual, as well as the general welfare. And they're creating a lot of opportunities for the West to get our collective heads out of our asses to start, just if you're thinking on that lower level of just like let's do deals and make money and do business, there's so many opportunities with Eurasia. And again, the Arctic is an incredible zone of untapped potential, um, which I think, when I look at the offers so many times that have been made over the years by the leaders around Putin, um, in China, which has advanced a polar Silk Road as an Arctic version of or expression of the Belt and Road Initiative that's been underway since 2018. Very, very tightly integrated with Eurasia's or with Russia's eastern, you know, Putin's Eastern Arctic vision that he called for back in 2019 for the first time, and really it's been growing, but at a slower rate than you would expect. The special military operation in Ukraine has sucked a lot of that momentum, but it's still moving ahead. And there's a real great will to really open up the Arctic for rail, for building new cities. Sergei Shoigu laid out a beautiful vision for building 5 advanced modern cities in the Russian Arctic in the east, all the way up through Vladivostok and into the north. So there's ideas like that have a future, and I think, and I advise Canadians that I talk to, I'm trying to organize people to tune their minds to that flank. Um, because the we hold on to the sinking Titanic ideology that got us into this mess, it's not going to be good. So that's my quick answer, but there's obviously a lot more details to that.
And we certainly will get into those. So, how could the Arctic be this critical zone for economic cooperation with Russia, with China? Because you laid out how both nations, really together now, are working towards development and cooperation around the Arctic.
Yeah, well, the Russia-China formed bedrock of a variety of multinational, multipolar institutions like the BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the what you're looking at strategically has been really since the 90s, but it really got underway when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 in September, which is an idea of Eurasian integration, which is sort of the response, or is Zbigniew Brzezinski's greatest nightmare. And back in I think 97 or 98, he basically said, okay, the unipolar world is here. It's the end of history. He agreed, but at the same time, he threw out a little disclaimer saying the only thing that could possibly challenge this would be some possible convergence of Russia, China, and Iran, which would never happen. So, that being said, here we are, and that's the strategic bedrock. The idea of building up again, I mean, I think at this point, last thing I read was the Belt and Road Initiative accounts for about $3.4 trillion of investments, direct and indirect, primarily through China's very, very robust banking system that's been able to maintain a very, very strong national directive behind it. Unlike many of the other central banks of most of the other countries, China's been able to not privatize their central bank and has been maintaining this ability to emit large scale credit for major projects. Russia's not as good at it, and Putin has said as much. He's described his envy of China and their ability to get things done, big things done. But you can see that there's definitely motion in that direction as well. Now, Putin has several things on the Arctic front that I think are of great important import for any Westerner who would like to survive the coming storm, which is number one, the international north-south transportation corridor, which is very, very harmonious with the Belt and Road Initiative, which goes from it's extended back above St. Petersburg up into the Arctic, where they're building up new ports, an expanded Trans-Siberian Railway, all the way down through Iran to major ports in the south of Iran to India. So that's involves something like 12 countries that are part of the corridor. But also when you build rail, you build roads up there, you're building up new opportunities to access resources that otherwise would not be resources because you just don't have a way to get at them. And that's sort of been the bane of Canada's sort of history, is that we've got this giant landmass. It's so big, and yet all of the population, like 90% of it lives completely within like 7 dominant cities strung up within 100 kilometers of the US border. So highly underdeveloped nation. It's wild how underdeveloped it is. Plus, on top of that, there's been a general policy by the British Empire, which has historically utilized Canada within a broader geopolitical great game in various ways over I would say, the last 200 years. to be a disruptive force at times when there was the likelihood of a positive burst of cooperation. You know, empires thrive off of divide to conquer strategies, keep everybody fighting each other. So, you know, whether I look at the times of Abraham Lincoln, who had a grand vision with Tsar Alexander II to extend telegraph lines and rail across the Bering Strait, the connectivity of the Lincoln Transcontinental Railway that was designed, you know, to go through British Columbia, through Alaska, through the Bering Strait into the newly forming Trans-Siberian Railway, which was also being built with the help of American engineers. I mean, Philadelphia rail cars were moving across Russia in the 1890s or 1905 when it was completed finally. And that was always designed to connect. And many of the leading figures that I outlined, who have been sort of almost written out of history, even in Canada, were champions of this. But many of them were involved. People like, you know, William Seward, the Secretary of State under Lincoln, who fought for this. There's many others. Tsar Alexander Nicholas II even commissioned a study of engineers in 1905 to go and see like how would this work as a bridge or a tunnel under the Bering Strait. Now Canada again played an unfortunately negative role at that time, which prevented it sort of served as a wedge between that potential alliance of the U.S. and Russia at that time. Of course, the U.S. under those days was of a different character than the type of U.S. that has run roughshod off of, you know, has gotten drunk on imperialism since JFK was murdered. It was a different idea of what the U.S. was. But again, it came back. You know, we saw this discussion with Henry Wallace and his Foreign Minister Molotov of Russia in 1942 to 44, where Henry Wallace was the vice president under FDR, and they had a grand vision again to revive this strategy of building the Bering Strait, opening up the Arctic for cooperation between the U.S. and Russia. That could also revive the better pro-growth traditions within the U.S. Within the Canadian population, and that was sabotaged. Again, the Cold War got in the way. A few murders, just like the murders that happened after the Civil War. Same thing sort of happened again, and uh, and the empire sort of latched on, and many of Roosevelt's enemies, amongst you know groups that today we call the deep state, but they were largely tied to Oxford and you know the London School of Economics Fabian Society that had largely infiltrated the U.S. Um, uh, foreign policy apparatus, which Roosevelt talked about. It dominated after he died in April of 1945 and started really shaping an Anglo-American special relationship under what Churchill called a world order run by British brawn and American brawn and British brains. So, you know, you had this very problematic disruption of like once again of this great potential of opening up the Arctic. Now, the we did have a certain spirit of optimism around scientific and technological progress. We had people like William Lyon Mackenzie King, who had some good advisors. People like O.D. Skelton, Ernst LaPointe, the Justice Minister, both of whom died mysterious deaths in 1940, which was weird. But then you also had people like C.D. Howe, who was somebody who really believed in getting things done and building large scale things like the Trans-Canadian Highway, you know, and he largely was able to get things done kind of in a similar manner that we see China being able to get it done today, to getting big things done today. Except that was also short lived. And it was done in the context again of the Cold War where everybody's knives ready everybody else's throats. So we didn't really see much as far as cooperation for a long time. And then, you know, there was a little burst of hope that I was surprised by in 2020 in September, when President Trump, in his first term, did announce an executive order that he passed endorsing the Alaska to Alberta Railway, which was a strategy formed by a consortium in Canada of different people who had been involved with rail. And they got the feasibility studies done. It got the endorsement, which would have connected for the first time Canada, you know, up to Alaska. It's never happened. It came close at different times, but it's always been sabotaged. And that would have again opened up the door to a broader dialogue around large scale, long term infrastructure development in the Arctic, which would harmonize our paradigm with that which is already active in Eurasia. So I was very much hopeful for that. When Trump came back in for the second time, I was hopeful that that dialogue around reviving the Alaska to Canada or Alaska to Alberta Railway was going to be revived as well. I haven't heard anything yet about that. And instead, there's this more belligerent chat, which is almost trolling. It's a weird idea of an expansion to Greenland and down into the Darien Gap instead, with an idea of a what is it an Iron Dome, which again reflects a very imperial, dangerous way of thinking about our relationship to Russia and to China, who I think in Trump's first term, he had a more of an orientation, especially up before COVID, but there was generally a consistent orientation to looking at Russia and China as business partners in cooperation. And I'm not seeing a lot of that. I'm seeing a new type of very virulent discourse, which accompanied with an idea of an imperial sort of Teddy Roosevelt, uh, revivalism could spell something really bad, which Canada in the past, like in 2005, when we had Jacques Chrétien, who again had tons of problems, power core, Desmarais, all that. Despite that, he was sort of that um old school politician that wasn't a technocratically ideologically driven person. So he was looking for opportunities to again do business with other countries that we could have otherwise have gone to war with. He resisted things like the bombing or Canada's participation in the bombing of Iraq, or the merger of the Big Five into the Big Three banks, or the Arctic ballistic missile shield, which Dick Cheney had put a lot of pressure onto Canada at that time, which we at that time were smart enough to say no to. Um, Unfortunately, now I'm seeing this Iron Dome discussion that Trump is whether he's paying lip service or whether he's serious is in my mind a very big revival of that anti-Russian war plan, also anti-China war plan, um, which would just be devastating. It would just be terrible. So no, it's going to happen. I mean, my polemic has been just generally for people who don't want to think about the Arctic or just want to leave it alone. It's like it won't be left alone. Like the people who are deciding global policy are not allowing it to be left alone. It's just that it's either going to be based upon a military war footing or it's going to be based upon looking at doing an honest, a real assessment of all of the incredible oil, natural gas. There's tons of resources that could drive as the first step, broader development strategy that could also involve, you know, a rethinking of how we've been treating the natives, the Inuits, who've largely been abused, kept out of any opportunities to develop, and and so we could, introduce a much healthier paradigm of cooperating with those First Nations peoples around this, that would benefit everybody and bring about a basis both of a viable economy, which I mean, right now we're sitting on an economy that's going to collapse. The Wall Street banks, the Bay Street banks even are locked into the global derivatives boondoggle, which is a time bomb that is set to blow up. So that's going to create untold chaos. So if we want to have an economy that's going to not blow up and not kill us, we got to, you know, build it upon firm foundations of what real value is. And that would be one good way to do it as a starting point, and also to avoid war, to create like a new basis of cooperation on something that would benefit everybody. Win-win.
This Alaska Canada rail corridor that you talked about a little bit, what is the vision behind it been, and how could it drive economic growth in Canada if it was completed?
Well, like I said, originally it wasn't a government sponsored project. It was done by a number of very frustrated rail executives who had been listening for too many years to discussions on whiteboards about, or at the time in the 70s, blackboards about how viable and possible it would be to build all these different rail projects all over Canada. There's been for what 45 years on the books a plan to build a rail high speed rail line since the 70s between like Quebec City through Montreal to Toronto and Windsor and down into New York, and that's been on the books for a long time. But it never happens. Nothing happens, and that's part of the game. I think of globalization is that the system since the early 70s, especially when the U.S. dollar was floated onto the floating exchange rate and was detached from all of those like real metrics that would determine what value should be in the productive agro-industrial world, that would allow us to at least discern whether the money supply was increasing and the behavior of investments was increasing, but nothing was being increased as far as the real world's productive goods. So then you could say, and you could do an autocorrect pretty quickly when you had that paradigm that the US dollar had to be tied to reality. When that was separated, things became more of a gambling casino. People started playing with increasingly fictitious assets, on the spot markets, the futures markets. Things like derivatives, junk bonds became more normalized. So things that you would normally go to jail for in the early 80s, like what Michael Milken went to jail for by playing with junk bonds. That's something that by the time 87, 88 rolled around, that became something normalized under Greenspan. And all of a sudden, what shouldn't have existed as far as just bundling different types of debts and then insuring the debts and then gambling on the price of the insurance of the debts and calling it different names, what Greenspan called creative financial instruments. That became something which grew like a metastasizing cancer from like I think the total I read a report um tracking the growth of derivatives internationally from 1987, which was about $1 trillion max, to 1992, which was about 3 trillion. Significant growth, but still not like crazy. By the time Bill Clinton took down Glass-Steagall, it was up to 77 trillion. But then when Glass-Steagall was taken down in the US, and it had already been taken down in Canada, that was our bank regulation that separated investment from commercial banking. They did that already with the British in 86. But that was what created what was known as universal banking, too big to fail banks. So that separation of clean banks from speculative banks, that when that broke legally, all of a sudden you had these mergers and acquisitions like we'd never seen, and you had growth of 77 trillion of derivatives in 1999 to becoming $730 trillion by 2008 when the housing market was blowing out. And it was never addressed. It was never dealt with. And as far as I could see, it's probably worse than it was then. Um, like they never addressed it. So that's the time bomb. That's going to blow. And at the end of the day, if we can get back to a discussion, because we're going to have an emergency conference. Question is it going to be those same arsonists who blew up the system that want to create chaos in order to then introduce a new world order, right? To introduce order out onto the chaos that they themselves have built into the system. That's where the race is in my mind. So as far as Canada, if we could participate, there, as far as I see it, the likelihood of that crisis accelerating and driving Russia, China, India, the various cooperative nations around the multipolar alliance, there's 135 nations already signed on to varying degrees with China's BRI. So a lot of those countries are going to participate in a conference, an emergency conference in some way. I don't know what form it's going to take, but it's probably going to look a lot like what was done after World War II under the Bretton Woods Conference, when you had, Franklin Roosevelt's allies, Harry Dexter White and others, battling it out with the British Empire's representatives, like John Maynard Keynes, who had very different visions of what the post-war world was going to be. And at the time, as I mentioned, you still had an anti-imperial tradition that hadn't been smothered in the U.S. at that time yet. So the U.S. was fighting to defend the right of India, of China, of the Chinese delegations, of the Russian delegations that did participate, and South American, to have their own New Deals, their own industrial Renaissance programs that would be given full support by the U.S. at the time. And Britain was the only country that was really fighting to defend the British Empire, the right to keep nations underwater, suffocating, and cash cropping. And that's where John Maynard Keynes came in with his Bancor, his universal unit that everybody would have to acquire in order to do international trade, that would be tied to the Bank of England and the Bank of Settlement, or the Bank of International Settlements, the sort of the central bank of central banks. And that was battled out. And while there was a victory, it was short lived because FDR, again, he died. Harry Dexter White, again, died a very convenient death. And all of those institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, became used as basically new neo-colonial weapons, as they were infiltrated by those who were allied to the British way of running the world, both within the US and abroad, and became used to do the sorts of things that John Perkins talked about in his Confessions of an Economics Hitman. So the idea, what really made that thing, the Bretton Woods idea originally, really viable was the banning of speculation. That was, and it still is. We could see how finance is weaponized, right? Both by getting everyone to have hordes of U.S. dollars, but also once that happens, you can launch currency speculators like George Soros to go and destabilize a country, or any of the vulture capitalist um, uh, companies associated with Wall Street or the City of London. They can just go and destroy Argentina or whatever, or Malaysia. So the Bretton Woods was premised on a fixed exchange rate system. So the relative rates of exchange had a consistency to them that allowed for having a sense of what the long-term value of the US dollar or anybody's currencies would be in 5 or 10 years. And with that, you were able to think in terms of longer waves, longer cycles. You could build larger scale infrastructure. Like look at what JFK initiated as far as building something like 70 hydroelectric dams. They take a long time. Building nuclear power plants takes a long time. But you have to have that type of stability in the system to encourage business people who are not going to want to take undue risk. With the sense also of having the nation state involved in the process to create that climate. And under the fixed exchange rate, where there wasn't unbounded speculation, there was a degree of stability. You had that. You could think long term. Again, even though there was tons of problems with it, I'm not trying to say this was like the utopian thing. But after 1971, it became a consumer society hub of speculation where we were told in Harvard Business School that if you cannot prove that you can get a monetary payback within 3 years, it's not worth doing. And so with that, we just stopped investing and maintaining our that infrastructure we did build up after World War II. We just stopped. The services sectors increased massively. The actual hard infrastructure decayed, atrophied. We didn't upgrade as we should have. And so again, back to your original question, these private entrepreneurs who were involved with rail, they had a lot of experience, a lot of engineers they were working with. They got frustrated and they basically said, let's create a business plan. Let's create engineering feasibility studies. And for some reason, I don't know how he got wind of it. He did. The leadership of Alberta in 2020 also endorsed it, and it would have been a good spark plug. And if you looked at the old website, unfortunately, this consortium has since been taken down. I'm hoping they can come back. It was a great website, and it was all vectored upon business strategy towards China. The idea was you can build it and you will garner the investment, knowing that China is creating um, a, a, a growth of demand for products that we could both manufacture and also that are just under our soil. So it was based upon a positive relationship that was not military. It was not aggressive with Eurasia, especially China. It was all over their website. I have a few graphs that I pulled off their website before they took it down. And I just think that that's a good conversation starter. It's a healthy way of starting it up. And I don't know if you want to talk about, some of the 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 the, the lost models of that were being advanced, like Arctic science cities and industrial cities, that people like John Diefenbaker advanced. We could talk about that too if you'd like, or you could wait.
The Canadian 2024 Arctic strategy. So how does it reject cooperation in favor of this warmongering, the servility to modern U.S. imperialism? And how does it compare to Canada's 2019 Arctic strategy? And maybe talk a little bit about how that strategy in 2019 came about.
Mm. Well, the 2019 strategy, and I'm not a total expert, but from what I had read about it, it was a lot healthier, in my assessment. It was much more geared towards it wasn't militarily belligerent. I think Russia and China were laterally discussed, but not as like an imminent threat or something to our world order. It was much more geared towards social justice, relations with the indigenous populations. It even like floated within that report of 2019. It was floating certain concepts that I are close to my heart, like the what's it called, the Gray Bay Road and port project way up in the Arctic, as far as preparing for the growth of shipping along the Northwest Passage. Something Russia is also doing, and that's part of the Polar Silk Road is preparate is with the ice caps in the Arctic receding, there's an increased shipping flow, which would cut off about 10 days of transit between Beijing and Rotterdam versus going around the conventional path through the Straits of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Cape or the Cape of Good Hope, even God forbid. But that Arctic passageway would cut about 10 days of traffic of time of moving freight. So similarly in Canada, there was more of a receptivity to looking at the long-term economic potentials. And this would be long-term, like building up this project I just mentioned. It would be a good 10 years to build, but it would build up also rail for the first time into Nunavut. That doesn't exist. There's no, sorry, not rail, sorry, roads into Nunavut, into the high north. That would be the first. There could be secondary rails as well. That would go all the way up to a port in the high Arctic, and that would go extend down into the lower provinces. Um, the only people currently fighting for that have been groupings of indigenous lobby groups who want this. It's not like they're happy with um the the quality of life that's been forced upon them in the reserve system all throughout Canada. I mean, it's abysmal, and I would say actually racist what's been done to keep these people in a state where they're told, we'll give you money as long as you stay in a small little area which has no future, no development. And so you can use some money to, maybe buy drugs and maybe have an economy based upon drug smuggling if you're banned along the US Canadian border. But otherwise, there's no opportunity, there's no hope. I've got friends who taught in schools in the Arctic, and my friend just came back a couple of years ago from teaching after 3 years in the Arctic in northern Quebec. There was like 3 or 4 students that he had who committed suicide. I mean, the suicide levels are wildly bad. Still no fresh water, safe water, drinking water in a large number of these reserves, despite the promises of Justin Trudeau. So I mean, it needs a lot of economic uh, like thinking. We have to think very differently about it. And so in that 2019 paper or report, I did see a lot of that. There's these at least these conversation was happening in a more constructive way, and I favor that. Um, Unfortunately, with the 2024 April 2024 Arctic Defense Strategy update that I feature in my report, as well as I've written a lot about that. It's a lot more dystopic, I would say, much more belligerent in its tone, with Russia and China as primary enemies. That you could see in the language of the report that we have to prepare for defending ourselves militarily. There's even a discussion about, and I don't know to what degree this has fully been accepted, but in that report, it called for starting with what is it, like a $2 billion long range missile field built up in the Canadian high Arctic. Called for it. It actually did it. That would have been political suicide, for the last 20 years, and now it just went and did it. So that was being published at the same time that Canada first floated its interest that Justin Trudeau, or whatever's controlling Justin Trudeau, I don't think he comes up with any ideas unto himself, but first floated the idea of joining the AUKUS, the Australian, UK, USA nuclear submarine strategy, which also Japan is in discussions to join and integrate into. Again, all of that is based upon an idea of an imminent war with Russia, China, and possibly India, which is where also we've seen, including in the Canadian Defense Report since 2022. And this was begun by the UK, then it was followed up by the USA, and then NATO more broadly, is an Indo-Pacific strategy. So it's no longer the Asia Pacific. They expanded their terminology to embrace also India as a potential enemy of freedom and capitalism. Um, so I think that that's largely also because India has chosen to not abide by the uh, the game plan for depopulation and just submission to a some form of technocratic world government. And because of that, there we've seen the reflection of that, both with a more aggressive policy to try to isolate both China and also increasingly militarily India, which the U.S. has ironically, military agreements with still, but also to kick out, to demonize India as a bad boogeyman, even in Canada. And India was not something easy to demonize in Canada for a long time. But there we go. They're burning diplomatic bridges by blaming, Justin Trudeau is blaming Modi for overseeing the murder of Khalistani separatists in British Columbia and expelling diplomats from India from Ottawa. It's absurd. But again, I think it's because these countries don't want to die. They want to create a viable economic architecture and a security architecture, which would be more hospitable to life and to survival, which they also have made the point that we should be joining here in the West. Like we're open to be involved and to cooperate and to reap the benefits of these Belt and Road style projects. So yeah, it's just lack of vision. I don't know if that kind of answers the question about the A2A
Oh no, no,
railway.
no. It's a look. It's okay. But when you mention the point of political suicide, the missiles in the Arctic, I think it leads into, and we're not going to discuss it here because we have so much more to hit on, not another time. But you and I have both focused on these anti-China psyops, the machinations of the intelligence agencies, the Five Eyes, towards China and influencing the opinions of the population in Canada, and that's been a huge. I think that's a huge reason of why that is possible, most certainly. But now let's talk about Russia's attempts to continue seeking economic cooperation with Canada, despite these sanctions since 2014, and for China as well. What cooperation are they wanting to do with Canada if Canada could, get its cap on straight and start working
Mm,
with the world?
yeah, absolutely. Well, Russia, I guess to start with, um, made a collective. I mean, I think the most strategic thing again, I've made reference to this briefly, but the Bering Strait rail tunnel is not a joke for the Russians. It's become a joke for most Canadians, but the Russians are taking that sort of thing very seriously because they're doing that sort of thing. They have active visions that are manifesting into reality, as are the Chinese, that are of large scale value, long term, and the Arctic again being such a high priority is a very real thing. They're looking at that as potential to be actualized. So in 2007, Putin first made the offer in a visit to the United States to build the Bering Strait rail tunnel. Um, he didn't get any traction, but the offer was still put on the table. Reports by think tanks covered his offer. They were circulated in Ottawa as well. Um, this offer was remade again officially by Putin in 2011. This time it was Obama in power. Again, couldn't get traction, but the offer again had a lot more character. Even Russia even offered to build 64 bill or put in $64 billion towards this 30-year. Because it's estimated that it could be around 30 years to build. It's a long wait. Now it could be done quicker if you really put in like a national crash science program driver behind it. Yeah, you could do it. Probably you could accelerate that timeline. But what they were looking at was a very conservative 30-year estimate. And yeah, I mean, $64 billion to build the tunnel and the core infrastructure around that between it's a 100-kilometer gap between Alaska and Russia with two little islands, the big and little Diomede. That's two-thirds of the overall estimated investment, which is pretty good. So they offered that. And again, couldn't get traction. China jumped on board in 2014. Global Times had an official offer, and that's considered in most analysts understand the Global Times when they put out foreign policy initiatives. That reflects a voice of a leading faction within the Politburo that also said, "Here, let's build the Bering Strait tunnel. It's part of the this idea of extending the Silk Road northward." And Putin again made a similar offer in 2019 or 2018 to again build the Bering Strait. So there's these on the record offers. The ambassador to Canada, the Russian ambassador in 2021, uh, Proskuryakov, I think it's Dmitry, had stated, and I quote, despite political difference between our two countries, I'm quoting him, prospects for Russia-Canadian Arctic cooperation look wide and generally positive. We could only use our possibilities properly. And then he also continued and he said, Being neighbors across the Arctic Ocean, we want to make maximum use of the Arctic potential as a territory of peaceful dialogue and sustainable development, which naturally combines realities and technological solutions of the 21st century with cultural and historical traditions of the indigenous populations. And of course, Russia has their own experience, a much healthier relationship with the Inuit and the natives of the Russian high Arctic, which have far fewer problems when you just look at any of the statistics as far as drug abuse, suicide, all of that stuff. Similar culture, right? Igloos, similar cultural dynamics, environmental dynamics, but yet much healthier outcome, much more involved and incorporated in the process of co-building with the state over many generations. Whereas in Canada, no such um, healthy dynamic seems to have ever been found. Either we've had the one extreme of assimilate and crush native culture, or weaponize the natives and use them as geopolitical tools on a chessboard. But we've never actually been able to strike the balance of just human relations of cooperation in a serious way. So that quote was from a 2021 speech by the Russian ambassador or consul general to Canada, and it reflects a lot. I think a general paradigm where Russia doesn't want to have war with us. They want to see partner in development. Now, on the China front, Canada had a good start in some ways. We joined the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, back in I think we 2014. I want to say we joined it. Maybe it was 2015. But again, the AIIB, as it's called, is largely staffed with ideological Western technocrats who have not permitted it to do much of relevance. So it's not become the instrument that it was designed to be as far as a real large scale credit emitter for international large scale works. That was its mandate, as was the new development bank created in Brazil that same year. Neither one of those two institutions have been permitted to really blossom and act the way they could. Again, a lot of this has to do with Western interests placing their technocrats into executive positions that has been blocking that. And that's a whole discussion unto itself. But all that to say, at least the spirit of joining it, even if it meant trying to influence the the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank towards a more imperial orientation, it was still a something to work with, I guess. And you had in what was it, 2017 or yeah, 2017 or 2018, Ambassador Liu Shaye, the Chinese ambassador to Ottawa, he um he made it very explicit. He said Canada should just join. I even have a quote here that I just pulled up while you were talking, where Liu Shaye stated, and I quote, okay, May 2017. He said that Canada would absolutely be an important participant, contributor, and beneficiary of the Belt and Road construction. Canada has already joined the AIIB, which makes for good conditions for Canada to participate in the Belt and Road infrastructure construction. It is hoped that Canada could enhance policy coordination with Belt and Road countries and seek specific areas and projects that it can take part in as soon as possible so as to gain early achievements through early participation. And then he references something that I was going to reference, but he references it. So I'll just continue reading. He says the government of British Columbia signed the Belt and Road cooperation documents with China's Guangdong provincial government last year. That was 2016. We hope that the two local governments will take quick actions and actively participate in construction. China is also willing to cooperate with Canada to jointly explore the third party markets under the Belt and Road Initiative. The initiative responds to the trend of the times, conforms to the law of development, and meets the people's interests. It surely has broad prospects. I hope Canada will not miss an important opportunity to cooperate. So that again was the official voice of the Chinese government into Canada, really expressing hope to build on this. Now this BC BRI treaty with Guangdong province is interesting because this is 2016. BC was getting a lot of resistance, and Ottawa didn't want that. China had made an offer for Canada to do as many other countries to sign an MOU on the BRI cooperation, which is just generally a framework in which creative discussions and diplomatic dialogue around details could occur. Ottawa refused. Now BC said, well, they saw the opportunity and they went renegade. And because of certain ambiguities built into the Canada's BNA Act, we've got like it doesn't say anywhere that a province can't go and just make a foreign treaty. And there's many cases throughout our history where provinces have made foreign treaties, whether it's Quebec with African nations or just went and did it. So that's just part of the Canadian weird system. And so BC did it. They made a foreign MOU that they signed. Fortunately, it ultimately didn't go anywhere, but still, it was a demonstration of possibilities. If you got a province that wants to do something and Ottawa is resisting, they can still do it. Um, so the thing that China was working on the most, I think, for Canada, because in the peculiar governmental system that is Canada, there's not a lot, and this demoralizes people who look into it, but people have to look at it. It's a fact. There's not that much to work with because of the highly centralized control around the Privy Council, but also the Privy Council office, the deputy governors that operate through the Prime Minister's office, the Governor General and the associated infrastructure around that institution, and the lieutenant governors all have a very sort of centralized cybernetics command, sort of feedback loop command and control system outside of the Senate and Commons. The decisions that are made by those who reflect the represent those representatives of the people, so called. And I shouldn't even say the Senate because they're appointed, but those people who have some accountability to the people, they don't have as much influence as many Canadians believe. And so with the big decisions, those that really disrupt global geostrategic policies, you will have the Privy Council intervene. And this is what we saw in the case when China was trying to bypass the governmental institutions to create synergy with powerful interests within Canada that could work on BRI projects internationally. And you had things like Acon, Acon Inc. was I think the third or fourth biggest construction company in Canada. They can do everything. They can build nuclear reactors, they can decommission them, they can do tunneling, they can do bridge building, hydroelectrics, they can do everything. One of these is a very, very useful company and with a lot of good engineers. And anyway, they weren't doing anything. Canada has no vision. Right. So their shareholders were getting very frustrated, and China made an offer to buy them, which would have made them, you know, owned by the Chinese construction. I forgot the name, one of the biggest Chinese construction companies. And the shareholders democratically voted, unanimously said yes, because that way that would put Acon Inc. onto a position where it could all of a sudden participate in international development projects and possibly use its clout to start getting some traction, even on building infrastructure in Canada too, which China desperately wants us to get back on track with that. So at the last minute, right before the deal was consolidated, the Privy Council steps in with CSIS and vetoes the sale as a breach to national security, cancels the sale, and Acon Inc. is left sort of flailing in the wind with no vision. We also had certain things with SNC-Lavalin back in 2016, 17, 18, even earlier, which involved a lot of cooperation on BRI projects internationally. And unfortunately, there aren't too many major firms like that that have the capability to compete and to participate in the types of BRI projects that are being built by China. But those are the few that we do have. And Lavalin got taken down a notch or two, and largely that had, I think, a lot to do with their participation with Gaddafi in building the great man-made water project in Libya that NATO bombed and destroyed in 2011. So there was this sort of renegade capability, and I think that's what China's been trying to look at a lot, is find a way. This is like private back channel diplomacy, right? It's the business diplomacy. It's significant. It's not an official branch of government, but it creates gravitational fields of influence and dynamic, which is what the game is always about. Um, so that's what they've been pushing on. I don't. I think that a lot was done by whatever it is that is controlling Ottawa to prevent our business community from having um to make from making those types of renegade decisions that we saw in those referenced instances that I just outlined. Um, but the will is still there. I mean, again, China and Russia together desperately want us to regain a pro-industrial, anti-consumer, anti-imperial mentality, which we haven't had for a long time. But they desperately want that because that would make us the first step towards rehabilitation, right? You got to, if you're a drug addict, you got to first admit you got a problem. We have to admit that we've been addicted to a false paradigm that's killed us. An addiction to cheap goods, an addiction to making money with nothing, an addiction to stealing from others. So we have to begin to admit that that's a problem and to begin to heal by building up a proper economy again, which would make us trustworthy partners. Because right now we're not trustworthy. Even if we joined up with a lot of these BRI or BRICS connected institutions, we're not trustworthy. We would do what we've been doing to the AIIB, which is infiltrate it, or what Stephen Guilbeault has been doing with the Chinese. I forgot the name of it. Uh, it's this the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, a massive institution in China. Uh, its executive committee or its executive vice chair is Stéphane Guilbeault, the Minister of the Environment in Canada. That's who was installed in China's, you know, crazy. This guy is anti-development. He's anti-human. They allowed him to be installed because he's somebody who's going to be doing sabotage along with a lot of the other white intellect, like ideologically technocratic Malthusians that they've installed across the AIIB and other institutions in China. So it's you know we can't, if we're going to relate and participate with China, we can't have that character. We have to have a character of more authenticity and a more honest sense of wanting to build and cooperate together.
In terms of, genuine vision for development and heading back to the Arctic again for a bit, the former Canadian Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, Northern Vision that he had, and he won the 1958 election in big part because of this. How is this vision going to be financed, and could this model work in the Arctic in the 21st century with some modifications to really improve living conditions, bring development to the North?
I love your question. That's great, dude. Yes, absolutely. Ethan Baker's. I didn't even know about it really. It was as somebody who studied Canadian history, it wasn't clear in my mind until I really like dove into the Northern Vision. And as you said, he swept into victory and had a majority government in 1958. And he really inspired. He spoke to um a deep something special within the Canadian zeitgeist that yearns for a purpose that is grand. He knew that we needed a vision, and without a vision, the people perish. And that's an old homage or an old adage, but it's been a truism since the times that it was written back in the Bible. um you have to give constantly people a challenge to go beyond their comfort zones, to challenge their limits individually and both as nation states. And when you do that, you bring out the best of your potentials. If you stagnate, you get worse every day. You don't meet challenges. You don't discover the better part of yourself as an individual or as a nation, and you be the worst elements of come out, space to then arise of selfishness, greed, all of these vices tend to become more normalized in that type of stagnant system. So Diefenbaker was really providing something that people crave deep down in their spirit, and the Northern Vision called for sort of like I don't want to say manifest destiny because that terminology has been used to do a lot of damage imperially over the years, but it really was this idea that there's this frontier of the high Arctic and we could go and build Canada into the north. And he had an idea which solved several core problems at the time. Now, number one, the one problem was that he was coming up with this idea just as the international banking system was going through a massive recession. So that was a problem. Big credit crunch. Number two, the problem also of uh, abuses against the native populations, the indigenous populations of Canada. You had between 1953 and 1958 the RCMP was assigned to oversee what's known as the High Arctic Reallocation Program of just extracting. You look into that, it's from your face. It's disgusting, right? Like we were extracting human beings who've been living for several generations in cities in the south of Canada, and just saying, telling them like racist zookeepers that no, your nature is to be in the high Arctic and seal hunt and stuff. And these are people who are like, what? And they were given a bunch of lies and stories about how the government was going to provide a really great future for them, and they got on helicopters and were dropped in the middle of nowhere, um, used as basically geopolitical human flagpoles as part of a gambit at the time for Canada to justify why big chunks of territory in the Arctic should be Canadian, because the idea was, well, if nobody's living there, Canada didn't have as much of a claim to saying that it's Canadian. So they're like, let's put people there. And also you had I mean, there were deaths. People who didn't know how to live in that type of very hostile environment. And so this was a scarring experience. And Diefenbaker had a vision for renewing the relationship with the native population. This is part of what he did with his Charter of Rights, or his Bill of Rights, I should say, in 1960, was to say, okay, let's create a universal set of rights that are inherent in every Canadian, independent of whether we're native or white or whatever. Let's have just universal rights in a constitution that is clearly codified, outlined, and it would have really broken this whole like imperial use of natives as well. And part of also what he wanted to do with the Arctic vision, when you look at the reports that are still available online, it was vectored around building roads to resources, so roads and rail that would extend upward. Some of the very interesting ideas involve the domed nuclear powered city of in Frobisher Bay, today's Nunavut, which would have been the most northern city anywhere in Canada by far. But the idea was that this was not going to be a resource extracting city. The idea, and it was fully thought through, and he allocated, I think, $76 million towards the first phase of doing the feasibility studies, carrying out the program. It's a huge amount of money, especially in those days. It called for having a permanent habitation with families, and so the designs were built. They look really cool. Involving like malls, amusement parks, community centers. Like it was really quite something. And about I think originally the design involved 5,000 people living in the same standards of living one would expect to live in Toronto, but in Nunavut. And that would then both facilitate pure scientific research as well as engineering and mining operations as a first start. So again, it's very different from the type of idea of temporary cities that are built up just to extract resources from a lumber area or from a mine just to disappear. It's not that. And this is supposed to be the basis of many other further similar cities. It's sort of a pilot project. Russia floated a similar pilot project idea in 2011 called the city of Umka, just like a few hundred kilometers from the North Pole. And it floundered. It got sabotaged. But the idea is still being discussed in high level circles in the Russian Academy of Sciences, as well as Shoigu's circles when they floated the five major Arctic cities that they want to build. It's similar. It's not These are not temporary cities. So yeah, the Diefenbaker vision would have solved a number of problems. Now, when the recession hit at the time, what was happening was a twofold problem. Number one, so one, you had a Rhodes Scholar, somebody who was part of the Rhodes Trust apparatus, named David Coyne, Andrew Coyne, as governor of the Bank of Canada. He was part of the Roundtable Fabian operation that I outlined in some great detail in my book series that had done a lot of damage to Canada. The chairman, the executive chair of the Roundtable Movement of Canada, it was called the Canadian International Council. It's sort of the Canadian version of the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. That guy's name was Walter Lockhart Gordon, major accountant. He also played a big role as a period for the finance minister. Also ran the Privy Council, but he was the champion of an idea of what's called new nationalism, to break Canada away from the pro FDR spirit that people like C.D. Howe had tended to exemplify. The idea again of having optimism for things like the New Deal and thinking about the future. They wanted to break Canadians away from that mentality. And John Coyne was a deep follower and collaborator with Walter Lockhart Gordon, and he put on a policy of money money contraction. So he basically said, if we got a recession, we got to withhold money. We got to use the Bank of Canada to contract the money supply. It's a Keynesian theory. It's garbage. And John Diefenbaker had a big fight with him, and he basically said, okay, well, we need to get more of a money supply because we have to stimulate the economy in a legitimate way, not just random, make work, but we have to really have a concrete vision. So that needs money. The other problem was that the victory bonds from World War II were maturing in 1958, 59. So people were also wanting to cash in on their victory bonds. And so his idea, like, how are you going to give people money when you don't have money? There's a money contraction. Um, So his idea that he came up with was to take control of the Bank of Canada and start using it as an instrument the way Lincoln did with the greenbacks to emit credit for the development of the nation, but at the same time to create what he called for as a conversion bond. So to take people's maturing victory bonds that they all invested in to win World War II, and instead of paying it with cash, convert it into an Arctic development bond with a new rate of interest and a new, 5 or 10 year growth, maturation that would then provide liquid capital for the type of investments to start up the Arctic vision. It was a glorious idea that would have worked if he didn't have so many saboteurs. Again, as I outlined, mostly Rhodes Scholars, even within his own cabinet, like Davy Fulton, who was his justice minister and operated with a Rhodes Scholars that also were tied to operations in Quebec and BC, doing a very similar thing. And that's part of our deep state sickness. JFK had his own deep state to deal with at that time. Also, ironically, being run by Rhodes Scholars like Dean Rusk and George McGee, who were overseeing turning the U.S. into an empire and getting sucked into the Vietnam War. So and they were interfacing always through the Council on Foreign Relations with their Canadian branch, and both Canadian and American were being directed, as I outlined in so many of my writings, by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, sort of the mothership of these major think tanks in London. And that's sort of the key controlling hand of the Roundtable movement internationally is the Royal Institute, or sometimes it's called Chatham House. So that's how they exert influence. So Diefenbaker's vision didn't go anywhere. Um, you had several Rhodes Scholars who went to work to destroy some of the cutting edge programs that C.D. Howe oversaw, and I don't think Diefenbaker had a proper understanding of who they were. That canceled the Avro Arrow, that chopped up into scrap metal, all like 9 prototypes that we had already built that were flying. That's the first hypersonic jet. They not only canceled it, but then they chopped it up into scrap metal to make sure that type of cutting edge science was going to be buried to keep society stuck in a system of controlled technologies that are already monopolized, that are part of a system of empire. Same thing with what C.D. Howe had been doing with nuclear. They largely made sure that his vision for broader Canadian nuclear renaissance was not going to happen. So they did the same thing to Diefenbaker. And he had a lot more, many more blind spots than JFK did. JFK, I think, was wiser. He had better advisors. He had like Eisenhower, he had MacArthur, he had Eleanor Roosevelt, he had many others, uh, all of the old guard who understood the Vipers to advise him. And he still died the same year that Diefenbaker got ousted. And it was as far as I would actually call it a coup d'état that orchestrated a scandal by design, kind of like he had his own Russia Gate in a sense, the way that we had the Russia Gate imposed in 2016. Same thing kind of happened to create a scandal to oust him over his firing of a Rhodes Scholar coin from the Bank of Canada, and he never understood what kicked his ass. Unfortunately, even to his dying days, he was always confused by what it was. He thought it was communists. He didn't realize what it was.
So you raise an interesting point, which no, the narrative around Diefenbaker being ousted is that it was like a JFK led thing. But the way you talk about it makes you sound like you believe it's more of the Rhodes Scholars, more of the animus of, say, United Kingdom that engineered his ouster. Is that fair to say?
That would be totally fair to say. I go through it in Untold History of Canada, Volume 3, Canada's Struggle for Progress. And I've got several chapters in there on that story. But yeah, JFK's enemies and Diefenbaker's enemies were the same thing. And but the tragedy is Diefenbaker hated JFK and JFK hated Diefenbaker. It's tragic because Diefenbaker was an unrepentant, you know, monarchist who took pride in the fact that the Queen herself had called him every week to give him briefings, and he took great pride in that, never realizing how the Privy Council that he was so honored to be a part of was actually working against his own better interests and the interests of Canadians. JFK was a Republican. He didn't have any respect for monarchical systems at all. So they couldn't get along at all, unfortunately, because they both loved progress and they both hated empire. Diefenbaker, I think his problem was he just, like so many Canadians of that generation, they read the Rudyard Kipling, they read the romantic British historians. The Brits like to self flatter their empire, and those are the approved historians who create narratives that really paint the empire in the most flattering way are the ones that are going to be published a lot and get played into school textbooks and across Canadian and Europe and British and Australian cities. So Diefenbaker, he read the propaganda and he just believed it. And he was like, oh yes, Britain spreads Christian civilization and progress. Let's have more empire in that sense. But he hated what empire was actually doing, which was preventing progress. It was preventing nations from being able to stand on their own 2 feet. He didn't understand that evil aspect of the empire. So he was naive, and his naivete resulted in him taking advice in a lot of really, really bad actors that were participating in murdering JFK. So yeah, it wasn't JFK. I think that certain narratives have been created for Canadians to sort of paint JFK as a bully or you know, but I just don't see that holding up to the facts.
All right, so now let's shift back to the very much to the domestic front. W.A.C. Bennett, who is he, and what was his vision to drive industrial development in the province of British Columbia? And, how far did he get? Why was his vision eventually sidelined?
Hmm. Your questions are fantastic. So W.A.C. Bennett was the premier of BC for about 20 years, from 1952 to 72, and he ran as the head of the Social Credit Party. Now, Bennett is not given a lot of respect, like so many of these people. Like he's called Wacky Bennett. Most Canadians who do know of him think of him as the name. Oh, they're like, oh yeah, Wacky Bennett, because his ideas were so wacky. And it's like, yeah, but if you look at what his ideas were, is William Cecil Bennett is his actual name. Um, he probably did the most of any premier that I can find as far as developing large scale, uh, serious nation building in his time running BC. And you know, there's so much that he did, and he did it always with a fight. He wrote about the saboteurs within his own government, within Ottawa, that were always preventing a lot of these big ideas from manifesting. But when he came in, BC was in shambles. It was just after World War II. Um, you had things like Power Core of BC, Power Corporation BC, which was a private. Most of the electrical systems were that did exist were privatized, and they were doing things for profit, extracting the maximum amount of money from people, and thus depriving people of the ability to actually, or the province as a whole couldn't really grow. Industry couldn't thrive because it was just usurious and it was very exploitative, and they weren't cooperating. He brought in a team, his brain trust of people who were pro-industrial, just generally like entrepreneurs, hardware. He himself ran a hardware store. That's how he learned politics. He ran a hardware store, and he's like, he kind of was a practical guy. He wasn't ideological. He wasn't into social credit ideology. He was just like, that was a conduit for him to get things done. So he used that as a political party. But then once he got power, it wasn't like he was just looking at, well, okay, well, what are the potentials in terms of hydro, water potentials? What are the resource potentials of BC? Let's do an assessment. And he fought for years to build rail. You had back then these things that were regularly happening every year called the ABCY conferences, the Alberta, BC, Yukon conferences. You also had the inter provincial conferences happening quite regularly. They don't these things don't happen anymore. But that was a big part of the way things got done. Because provinces have a lot of control. According to our BNA Act, which is still active, um, provinces have immense control over the destiny of the resources within the province. And I already referred they can make a foreign treaty for Christ's sakes, like it's huge. No, most governments you can't do that. Um, so a lot of the rivers though go across provinces, so you need collaboration. A lot of things that you want to do might involve cooperation between two or three provinces or territories. So what he did also with the various governors of Alaska was he put forth strategies to connect rail to build rail northward, which he did all the way up to Dease Lake, which today it basically got sabotaged when he got ousted, and his vision to connect DC into Alaska um, as the driving force of a much broader development strategy it went nowhere, and it got sold for like $1 as a joke somewhere. It's called the Rail to Nowhere, but it was like part of a process that we halted. He also had a program for building up the Peace River in the north of BC. Some of the the Wollaston Reservoir and these big dams and hydroelectric dams in the Peace River area in the north was a big driving force, and it wouldn't have happened, as he made a point, if JFK had not entered, and he befriended JFK before obviously the latter died. And JFK gave also the endorsement to build up the Columbia River Treaty Basin, which was the development of the hydroelectric dams of the south of BC that were tied to the broader Columbia River, part of a much bigger water basin. And this is all part of a different paradigm of growth than what you and I have been living in. So he had the idea also of creating a Bank of British Columbia, a Bank of BC, to be sort of to serve as a national bank, because he had great hope that Diefenbaker's fight over the Bank of Canada was going to be successful. But as he saw Diefenbaker was failing to take control of the Bank of Canada, and he was not going to get any assistance from the Bank of Canada, he was like, well, I guess we should just do it ourselves. And so he made a lot of moves. That was like part of the key of his battle plan. And I think he did actually create the Bank of British Columbia, but again, he was old and he got ousted before it could be used for anything. And eventually it got taken over by, I think it was HSBC, an international drug bank in the late 70s or early 80s that took over that bank and turned it into part of the global narcotics trafficking operations. It's a sick, sad joke. But no, I mean Diefenbaker was somebody who had a vision, and he's been slandered like crazy, and because I think that those who have slandered him are afraid that people will learn and be inspired by the type of program that he put forth. And also, I would say, surprise, I mentioned that a lot of the development in Canada's history happened in spite of Ottawa and not because of Ottawa. And in this case, in Quebec, around the same time, um, you had what's called you had this massive hydroelectric dam building program that was begun in the late 50s under Maurice Du Plessis and Daniel Johnson Sr., who later on became premier, and Paul Sauvé, who also died after 4 months as premier. They weren't able to get any support from Ottawa. And so, how did they build the massive hydroelectric dams on the James Bay, on the Hudson River, and across Quebec? How did they do that? They did it. How did they get the money? They didn't get the money from within Quebec. They got it from BC. They got it from W.A.C. Bennett, because W.A.C. Bennett was able to build up such a robust economy that he was able to have a reservoir of free energy, of lot of excess money that he could then loan at a very low interest long term loan to Quebec. And I forget the quantity of the loan, but it was significant. That was, I think it was even $100 million. It was big. That then Quebec was able to use to then get their hydroelectric vision kickstarted, which over time, long term good things take time, began to start paying off its own uh, debt. But that's the way it works, right? It's these were self liquidating loans, loans that were not tied to that were anti inflationary. Most people today think if you take out a debt, it's going to be inflationary. No, it's not true. If you do it with an understanding of the science of physical economy, the way these people were operating under an understanding of what was physical economy, what generates real value, you have an understanding of what are self-liquidating loans. So loans, debts that you create that will extinguish themselves when the project is finished and begins to completely qualitatively upgrade and transform your entire economy. And that's the way the U.S. did it. The U.S. did it under the New Deal. We saw this with the space program too, where there was like $10 returned on every dollar invested in something that seemed very, very monetarily expensive. But the amount of discoveries you make along the way by giving people a concrete vision that's long term is they have to do the impossible, and they're going to make all sorts of unexpected discoveries that only humans can make along the way that apply to you know medic you know EKG technology, microwaves, satellites, different types of mineral processing and smelting technologies, like all sorts of things are discovered along the way, big and small, that are again mathematically unpredictable. Like you could never have predicted that those discoveries were going to happen, but though they were unpredictable, they were lawful. And they completely transformed the topography of your entire economy and culture at the same time, because you're making new discoveries, rendering old theories about things obsolete, right? So when you do that, you break free of the limits to growth. All of the Malthusian formulas that try to justify why we have to adapt to scarcity, they all become irrelevant when we introduce something new. Those who had capitalized on and monopolized the old knowledge, the old resource bases, they all of a sudden lose their power over influencing systems. And that's where I think, again, Diefenbaker, Bennett, Kennedy, Daniel Johnson Sr., Gall, they were all they all had that paradigm, that understanding that that's how you do things as a human species, and that's how you achieve any type of durable cooperation with your neighbors is through that type of process. It's not through power politics, projection, or whatever. It's through the other way of thinking. And you and I, like we and a lot of our viewers, just haven't had any experiences of that in our living lifetime. So it's hard to wrap the mind around how that's possible. But that's why it's helpful to look at China today, or its allies, because that's like a living example of something we used to kind of do.
Actually, speaking of China, I'll quickly mention when you mentioned W.A.C. Bennett and the comments that were made towards him around railways to nowhere, that reminds me a lot of comments that were made around China and its building of these subway systems, right, for cities that they hadn't really developed yet. And then 5, 6, 7 years later, it's wow, look at these rail, look at the subway, look at the rail. Again, those phrases just kind of like it clicked. It reminded me of the rhetoric, how little it might have changed around the history of BC because I was reading the report and some other stuff and I found it very interesting. How did the territory making up now the province of British Columbia nearly come into US hands in the 1860s? So how and why did this end up getting blocked? And how much did this situation actually drive the creation of Canada?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the most important pivots to our entire history. The pivot around the battle for BC in the wake of the Civil War is so big, and that for me was some of the biggest mind-blowing discoveries that I made in my research over a decade ago. Was looking at like what was up with, like, the first anomaly I encountered was BC. Canada in the 1860s is a very different thing than the Canada today. Um, and you can look at any map from that time, and you'll find that Canada was mostly, like um, four little British colonies on the East Coast, and then you had British Columbia as a thing sort of separated from like 2,000 kilometers or more of territory, and then like two-thirds or so of the landmass is Hudson Bay territory. It's privately owned Rupert's Land, Hudson Bay land, which is sort of a subsidiary. You could think of it as a subsidiary of the British East India Company, and that was there for 200 years. That was Canada. It's weird. So one of the I'm trying to think of an efficient. Because I know I've been delivering these very long contextual responses, which may not be this question you're asking calls for a lot of context, so I don't want to go into too many rabbit holes. But what I'll say is that there was a major fight over keeping Canada British, um, especially when it was becoming clear in like 1864 that the Union was not going to disintegrate as certain grand strategists had hoped, like Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, or Lord Cecil Glasgow, Lord Cecil Glasgow, anyway, or Lord Glasgow Cecil, that's his name. Yeah, these British names. Who were coming out very much in favor of supporting the Confederate South secessionists in the idea of creating a slave power that would have a new confederation of the South that would have a special relationship with Britain. Britain, of course, economically had a massive amount of influence over the Confederate South, the Virginia slave power. They bought 80% of the cotton from the slave plantations. 80% was bought by the British Empire. So they had a big interest in keeping that going. And you had groupings that had formerly run things like the Hartford Convention in 1814 to basically undo the Constitution, to break away and join British Canadian operations or British Canadian territories, and to create a confederacy of the North with a special relationship to Britain. So this is what people like William Lloyd Garrison, for example, was a big promoter of. They call him an abolitionist, but he was actually a major advocate of breaking up the Union, undoing the Constitution, and essentially integrating into Canada, which was first laid out by Aaron Burr, the same guy who created what today has become Wall Street. That same Aaron Burr had laid out this vision on behalf of British foreign uh, I guess the colonial office of Bentham was what was behind it, um, which was subverted by Alexander Hamilton a couple of times, 1800, 1804, and then after Hamilton was killed by Burr, it was subverted again in 1807 when he had a whistleblower who talked about this and went to the Congress. So there's been a lot of efforts always to kind of do the same thing, undo the Constitution, break up the US, create new confederations that were tied and were more controlled by the city of London as a top-down control mechanism. Now, one thing I discovered in my research is that there were not one but two anti-Union confederacies deployed against Lincoln by the British. And one of the two succeeded and the other one failed. The southern one failed, the northern one succeeded. The Northern Confederacy operation was the B&A Act, which was originally put together and was drafted in 1864. And the idea, and it was only signed into law in 1867, 2 days after Russia had sold Alaska to the USA, I would add, and that's not a coincidence. And coming out of the Civil War, there was a lot of pro-Lincoln nation builders in Canada. One figure who plays a big role in my research is Isaac Buchanan, a Scottish Canadian industrialist who was a major controller of the then Liberal Party, an enemy of Johnny MacDonald, and he fought very hard to keep Canada neutral because at the time Britain was threatening to use their operations in Canada to invade the Union from the north. I think we had like 10 or 15,000 British troops stationed, ready to receive orders to attack Lincoln. Buchanan made speeches on record and that were successful at keeping Canada neutral. Um, John Wilkes Booth was sent to Canada to receive pay, instructions. Confederate operations, intelligence operations were headquartered in the St. Lawrence Hall in Montreal and in Toronto and in Kingston that were running terrorist maneuvers like the Albany raids down into the north, into the south from Montreal. So it was an intelligence hub. It was really bad, and so Buchanan was a major player, and he was an advocate of the weakening British Empire. At the time, Britain had expended a lot of its efforts to destabilize the world. India, the Chinese Opium Wars, the Crimean War that Britain organized to destroy Russia. Like Britain had stretched itself very thin, and people were beginning to wake up to the nature of the beast much more broadly. And Buchanan put forth an idea of Canada becoming an independent republic. Now, certain people like George Brown, as well as MacDonald, despised that because they were both loyal to the system of hereditary power was the British Empire, and they worked to subvert him. Finally, they did oust him. George Brown led the charge in ousting Buchanan and essentially took charge of the things that he had formerly been leading. He was at the time the head of the Globe newspaper, what became the Globe and Mail, one of our fathers of Confederation. And increasingly the pro-Lincoln figures in Canada were ousted from the federal positions, but you still had certain key players in British Columbia who did want to either they wanted an economy basically. They weren't Republican per se, but they just wanted a future. Now the problem with BC was that it was separated by this vast territory of the Hudson Bay land, private land, couldn't be developed, and their economy was crap. They'd just gone through a bubble that popped. There was a gold rush, so you had ghost towns. People's lives were ruined. Um, the British Empire exerted no influence over the economy of the British Columbians. And so there was a lot, the only relationships that they had was with people living in San Francisco and Oregon. So there was increasingly out of desperation and it's also a sense of optimism for the future, an idea that, okay, we should join the US. And Lincoln had a whole vision to extend the Transcontinental Railway that was being built. It was finally finished in 1869 to extend it northward through British Columbia. So you had in 1869, you had Governor Frederick Seymour, who was a pro-Lincoln governor of British Columbia, who was very supportive of the annexation movement of BC merchants, had almost unanimous support, and the prospect again of building rail and joining the U.S. at the time, I think was legitimate. Because again, when people ask me like, "Are you for Canada joining the U.S. or not?" I'm like, I don't have a binary answer. It's all contingent on does the U.S. does the U.S. have um, an obedience to natural law, or is it an empire? Is it acting like an empire? Because under those times when Lincoln or I could say Garfield or JFK were in play, they were forcing a constitutional natural law system in place that would have made it legitimate for Canada. Like I'm like Canada should have probably been the 14th state, maybe not the 51st, but when Benjamin Franklin was up here in Montreal organizing for Canada to become the 14th colony to say we're going to sign the Declaration of Independence together, that was much more legitimate. Obviously, it didn't work out, but you know, there's I think something similar happened under the time just in the wake of Lincoln's murder. But despite the annexation petitions, but despite the efforts, you even had Senator Charles Sumner, and William Seward, the Secretary of State, who also survived an assassination the night that Lincoln was killed. He got stabbed like 20 times, but he survived. But he oversaw a massive grand strategy with his allies in Russia. Russia, by the way, saved America during the Civil War, and there was an understanding Russia and the U.S. had a common destiny and a common enemy in the form of the British Empire, and that's something most Americans don't even know that that Russia sent their battleships to New York and San Francisco to a huge deal, right? And it plays into the story because those same allies who brokered that deal were the same ones who then brokered like Ambassador Stokel, Grand Duke Constantine, were big admirers of Lincoln, as was Alexander II, who signed off on selling Russian Alaska to the Americans, which made it very clear. And you could read the writings of Sir John A. Macdonald, of George Brown, of Sir George Tatsier, of Alexander Galt. Their writings, they talk about it. And I quote them extensively, where they're all aware that if they don't gain control of British Columbia, that the Americans are going to go there and build rail. They know that. And Lincoln gave a speech, his State of the Union, right before he died, calling just for this thing. Um, Now, so there's a race over this real estate. Canada became a hot real estate. And oh yeah, so Sir John A. Macdonald said in 1865 that I would be quite willing personally to leave the whole country a wilderness for the next half century, but I fear if Englishmen do not go there, the Yankees will. Um, so it just shows you like what a lack of vision, like what a utilitarian geopolitical intention behind doing something that should be really you should take pride in the idea of like building the Canadian Transcontinental Railway should be a point of accomplishment that you can be happy about. But it's like he doesn't even want it, but he just knows that it's politically expedient to do it because otherwise the British Empire will lose its influence over North America. And he even said, this guy who's like the George Washington of Canada, that's how he sold us. He even said, a Britisher I was born and a Britisher I will die. He never identified as Canada, as a Canadian, I should say. He's always loyal to that other thing across the ocean. And he was an Aryan racist. Um, like he was openly calling for creating laws that would that would define Canada as purely Aryan. So he's actually bringing in a Teutonic Aryan language into saying what would be Canadian and who would get rights. Um, Now people say, "Oh, but forgive him. That was the times he lived in. You cannot hold him accountable for that." And it's like, actually, he was the only member of parliament to make that position at that time. So no, I don't forgive him. Now that being said, there's this big fight. Now Frederick Seymour gets sent on a weird diplomatic mission to try to find peace between two disputing native bands in the Arctic or in the north of BC. He comes back dead. So he's sent on this weird mission, and he's already like John A. McDonald has already expressed his anger and his awareness that there's the conspiracy that the governor Seymour is participating in to block BC's joining Confederation. So they really want to lock in BC. Now, one thing that they're doing is they're saying to the annexation movement, merchants and others, they're saying like, just don't join the U.S. We will pay off your debt. We'll build you a rail. We'll build you a rail, and we'll do build the rail. We'll also connect you with the rest of Canada by passing a law in the British Parliament to nationalize the Hudson Bay land, which they do all in like between 1869 and 1870. And the only thing standing in the way at that point is Seymour again. So they send Seymour up north, comes back dead, and Cosimo de More, an asset, a tool of McDonald is installed in his place and steamrolls, drives the joining of BC into the Confederation. So that sort of breaks up the potential alliance of the US and Russia over Arctic cooperation in a big way. And it sort of, I think, solidified Canada's character as a wedge, a geopolitical wedge between this Arctic friendship, this brotherhood, which again came back, as I mentioned, with Nicholas II, who commissioned teams of rail engineers to go up and do feasibility studies from the United States. It came back again with FDR and Stalin, who had made a lot of arrangements towards cooperation on the Arctic and especially the Bering Strait. But Canada always kind of played a negative role because we weren't acting in the interests of Canadians. We were always acting in the interest of the British Empire, which is what it says and codifies within our BNA Act, which is also another thing which was signed into law a day or 2 days after Alaska was sold, was the British North America Act was passed, which established quite literally a nation founded upon British principles and for the to promote the interests of the British Empire. It literally says that we exist to promote the interests of the British Empire in our founding constitution, if you want to call it that. And it also codifies the role and powers of the Privy Council, the Governor Generals, the Lieutenant Governors, as sort of a deep state structure built into the system, which is again part of the unfortunate bane of Canada's existence. Been people's desire to treat this as a legitimate thing and not see this as a bunch of very um sick scraps designed to create a false pseudo nationalism for the benefit of something that doesn't care about Canadians. So yeah, it's the story of BC in that era, which yeah, it's such a pivot of history. It's so important that people look at this, and so few have, very few.
All right, now I want to jump forward in time, talking about the former North American Water and Power Alliance. It's that kind of project speaks of where there could be genuinely positive cooperation between North and South. I mean, such a dramatic difference from, the current era of, the annexationist threat from, an imperialist American president this alliance of the past. Can you talk about it and why it failed?
I got a chapter on that in the pamphlet that we're referencing. The North American Water and Power Alliance. It's something that's it will piss off a lot of Canadians because a lot of Canadians have been. It's weird what's happened to us. There's been a lot of propaganda by people like Walter Gordon, George Grant, another founder of the New Nationalism of Canada, also a Rhodes Scholar, by the way, um, who promoted a lot of very influential propaganda to convince Canadians that our identity is that we're not American. That's though we look and sound in many cases very similar to Americans, our identity is that we like hockey, we're polite, maple syrup, and we're not American. That's not much of an identity to be founded upon. And part of the that goes with it secondarily is the idea that the Americans intrinsically want to steal our water. And that's partially true if you look at, but it's not really like what are we talking about when we're talking about that thing inside of America that has this imperial ambition to use and to take our stuff, especially water. Now, if you look at Nestle, they're already doing that. So from the as far as the corporate takeover of the Canadian economy that really happened, especially under the age of globalization, um, we already did it. Like Nestle buys up thousands of gallons of Canadian water that they bottle and sell, for $2, $3 a bottle for pennies. They give us pennies. So it's already happening. But so people will not differentiate that which has already happened that we let happen from the thing that is NOAPA, the North American Water and Power Lines, which is different. So the North America that was originally put forth in the late late 50s originally as a design from a company called the Parsons Company. It's since become a very corrupt company tied to very bad things in recent years. But back then, it still had it's part of the ethos of the era. And and it was part of the idea that we could foresee that there was going to be droughts, major water crises in the future. And you could act in the present on those future crises by creating abundance and the management of the water system. So what happened is it's the continental look, the different water flows. One of the characteristics is that a disproportionately large amount of water rains in the high north, in Alaska, Yukon, northern BC. Fortunately for the continent, it's an immense amount of water that rains up there and that flows directly into the ocean. And that, through a natural biorhythms, you have evapotranspiration or evaporation from the ocean goes back up into the natural atmospheric rivers and that rain back down onto the landmass and that do it all over again. Now they don't participate really in life, doesn't participate in the economy or biospheric activity. And so they were looking at, well, how do they take maybe 5 to 10% of the water runoff in the north and move that water down to first capture it in reservoirs, then move it down using gravitational flows of the earth into areas that need it, both to replenish the Great Lakes. So move creating like a barge river, which would have some hydroelectric potential throughout Canada to clean out the Great Lakes, replenish, and also similarly down southward into California, Texas, Mexico, that would green the deserts and replenish the aquifers and provide a lot of bountiful fresh water, as well as a lot of hydroelectric power. I think it's like 277 gigawatts of hydroelectric power along the way. So it's a huge mega project. It's the biggest thing. The only thing as big that as this that we've seen is probably what China's doing now with its water diversion projects. So this got the support. It was falling in at the time when W.A.C. Bennett and JFK were also organizing the Columbia River Treaty, the Peace River, which, by the way, the Peace River and Columbia River are part of the NOAPA design. So in my mind, we've already begun the NOAPA by JFK and W.A.C. Bennett's work. But they didn't give it the name. They didn't. Bobby Kennedy did. He actually did start campaigning for and endorsing the NOAPA program because they could foresee they were thinking longer term, and they could foresee that there would be what we are now seeing as far as fires, droughts, other things that would naturally happen as you deplete your freshwater systems. So there have been engineers that have done 21st century upgrades on this. And I find that they're very inspiring. They really awaken, in my mind, the imagination in terms of looking at what's possible, in terms of looking at what would be what would allow us to create win-win relationships with the US, who desperately needs water. We also need to have a wiser use of our resources. So how can we do it in a way that doesn't involve US corporations just stealing stuff to turn it into money, but that rather builds new cities, which we haven't built a new city in like 70 years, you know? So why not build, like, think about nation building? China's built like, I think 400 new cities in the last 20 years. Like, it's crazy the level of development. We totally lost touch with that. So it'd be cool to be able to regain that sense, and again, to negotiate a relationship that we all benefit by having pro industrial growth economies with the US would be a really nice way to reset our relationships with them around a non-imperial way of doing things. But again, it requires a different spirit in the Canadians. I don't know how viable it is with the current um, zeitgeist, as well as people like Mark Carney and, other eco technocrats that are religiously against this sort of thing ever happening. Um, so I think it's a nice idea. It inspires me, so I put it out there to try to stimulate, discussion. Practically, I don't know how viable it is though.
All right, so just quickly on this because we still have a few more things to get to. Can you just quickly talk about the Chinese, since about the turn of the millennium, the Chinese have been really active in terms of water management and ambitious nationwide projects. Can you just quickly bring up an example or two on that front?
Yeah. Biggest one is the Move Southwater North. They're not good at naming projects inspiring. Move Southwater North. But it's a great project, and it's a three-phase project. I think it's like $64 billion. Um, and it involves taking water. Similar problem to the North American continent. Kind of has like a lot of water flooding in the south, but a lot of dryness, aridity in the north. So this idea, and again, the first two phases have already been done. Is find build water diversion canals, other things, tunneling, because you don't want to lose a lot of the water through evaporation, so you want tunneling to move that north, and then it'll when the final third phase is finished, which is they're moving ahead of schedule. It'll be done before 2050, the third phase. Water will be sent to start greening the Gobi Desert. You'll routes that'll go all the way to Tibet to benefit the Tibetans with a massive amount of hydroelectric power generated along the way. It's the biggest thing we've ever done as humans. It's happening right now. And China's built like the five of the 10 largest hydroelectric dams in the world have all been built by China in the last 20 years, starting with the Yangtze. And there's one that's like three times bigger as far as like energy it'll be generating than the Yangtze was. That's being built right now, I think in Tibet. Not I think, it's in Tibet. So there's these giant programs that are, again, people are like, oh, that's communism. I don't, but it's like, well, it's the nation initiating it. But you could look at the amount, there's hundreds of private companies and entrepreneurs who are getting contracts to do the job in different degrees, So it's not just one thing. It's it's a nice synergy of public and private in a healthy manner where the nation state is playing the role it's supposed to play as far as representing the interests of the people and the culture. So, people can complain about the you know how these big projects are affecting natural ecosystems and stuff, and it's like, well, yeah, that's happening, but I mean, some people want deserts to remain naturally desert and dead forever, and others see deserts as being something which might be even natural to green a desert. I mean, NASA just did an overview and found that there's 10% more biomass than they expected grown since the 1990s. The vast majority of that increased biomass has everything to do with India number two and China number one, and the type of economic thinking. So that it's demonstrating that there's actually, we've been lied to when we've been told that human economic development has to always come at the expense of nature. Not true. Nature can actually, if you do it well, nature can actually thrive as the economy grows. It's possible to do. It's actually necessary to do both at the same time.
So last summer, I was invited on a media tour, and I went to see the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and I was able to see there's the solar panel. They had almost like a solar panel farm out in the desert in one of the cities. I'm blanking on the name right now, but that is another use example of how the nature in the desert can be really functionally used. Now, of course, it should be emphasized that China does believe very firmly in the potential of, green energy, but it's different than, say, a Germany, etc., which is committing national suicide by cutting off traditional energy sources, before these are functionally useful. Because maybe one day these things can be the leading forces, but until these things are fully developed and taking care of an entire nation, to demand a transition to them in 2 years, 5 years is utter national suicide. Now, the other thing I want to say is my personal view on it. Look, I personally do view China as socialist, but my view on socialism always is a ruthless scientific way analyzing. It's a toolbox fundamentally to me, right? And you use it depending on your conditions of the nation. And so for me, when China does when it does these things, it has the national most crucial vectors of the economy. It'll have those nationalized, it'll have them under tight state control. And then other areas, it will allow private enterprises to come in and have competition where it's useful, because competition is useful. It can be very useful under the market. So that's where I do believe in the market socialism. I think the market has its place in society.
Those are really good points you just made. I totally endorse that. And yeah, like FDR had said, and that there's two kinds of communists that we can get along with. There's the feudal communists that we can't, and then there's the industrial communists that we can. And Stalin said something almost identical about capitalists. He's like the industrial capitalists we can work with. Um, but the Fabian capital, like those who are like promoting like the British Empire, but under the veneer of capitalism, that's not that's feudalism under a capitalist veneer. And so if you're I think got that spirit, that idea of wanting to protect labor, protect people, and like resist empire, then we'll find examples of people who thought of themselves as capitalists like JFK, who fit the bill, as well as communists who also fit the bill and who were able to like synergize and collaborate on all sorts of really big things that pissed off imperial systems a lot. So it's just a beautiful irony that I've found. And yeah, like markets should have their role. Competition has a really important role, but it shouldn't be what you don't let private the private class uh control your global policy. Like you have to keep it in as contained in a certain way. These banks are instruments, they're not the thing that are supposed to shape your world. But I just want to say I really appreciated your addendum.
All right, well, fantastic. So let's talk about going into this late 60s, 70s now. Maurice Strong was a name that came up a lot in your booklet. So how did he contribute towards the implementation of a post-industrial vision for Canada that really came into play, I believe, from 1971 onwards? And this time might be shocking for Canadians because we saw deindustrialization occurring pretty heavily after NAFTA. But from what you're saying, this vision came in 20 years earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Maurice Strong was a highly connected, strange creature from I think Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan produced some really weird people. Kearney, I think, also came out of there. Anyway, um, not to say I have a lot of good friends who are from Saskatchewan, but I'm just thinking that there's a lot of very high level oligarchs as well who seem to be generated. Yeah, I don't. There's something going on. Anyway, Maurice Strong early on, I think possibly through his uncle Frank Strong, who was for a period the president of the YMCA, was on the radar. I think he's connected to some noble families of Europe, but that's a whole side thing. Anyway, he was put on the radar of David Rockefeller and did a little stage, as they say, in New York at the Rockefeller Plaza. Whatever he did, he impressed a lot of highly influential figures around David Rockefeller and found himself very quickly in his 20s the CEO of several like mining companies. And he became like the youngest vice president of Power Corporation by 1963. overseeing sort of the new technocracy that was introduced that overthrew the old guard during the Quiet Revolution. So he was that. He quickly became the Minister of External Affairs of External Aid, sorry, of Canada under Lester B. Pearson, and he was the founder of the Canadian International Development Corporation, CEDA or Development Association, CEDA, in 1968. And so under that position, he began to work to undo the type of foreign policy paradigm that John Diefenbaker had reflected, which was the idea of assisting Pakistan in or India or any recipient nation receiving money from Canada. Diefenbaker wanted them to have cutting edge advanced technology. He wanted them to have industrial progress. So did JFK. So that paradigm had to come to an end. And Maurice Strong seems to have been the one who was assigned to play a big role at destroying that first in Canada by saying that, okay, from now on, we will allow loans to poor countries under the condition that they abide by what he I think he pioneered this term appropriate technologies, um, as well as IMF conditionalities. So to the degree that they abide by the conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank are also pushing, and that they only allow that those funds we give them to go towards appropriate technology, that is technology that will not impact the ecosystems or their cult like their way of doing things in any significant manner, we will permit it. Also, he oversaw with this other guy, uh, Georges Henri Levesque, who was one of he's called the father of the Quiet Revolution. He's the father of social science, a follower of Aldous Huxley in Quebec. He ran the University of Laval and had a think tank that Pierre Elliott Trudeau worked in for 2 years before Pierre Elliott Trudeau was sent in to become a member of parliament and then justice minister and then prime minister. But before that, he was working under Georges Henri Levesque to create a new technocratic elite in Quebec first, and then it was done later on in the federal level. So Georges-Henri Levesque was working with Maurice Strong, especially with a focus on creating new universities in Rwanda, which he did in 68, 69. And that was designed to create a new sort of infrastructure to indoctrinate African leaders to then kind of like what the Rhodes Scholarship does to, various select elites from around the world. They get, an all paid expense of brainwashing in Oxford, and then they are sent back to whatever country to carry out the administration or infiltration of the deep state. Such too was the Rwandan university that George Henri Levesque set up with Maurice Strong's help. So that was the first wave, just corrupting the idea of loans from the former idea of helping nations stand on their own 2 feet, of breaking free of empire, of not just giving people a fish, but really teaching them how to fish, into this other thing of creating dependency, and creating institutions that would train corruption and built into victim target nations that you would want to keep underdeveloped and under the heel of a higher power located in far away. So it was at that point I think he was just very effective. I don't know how he had this charisma, almost what's been described as almost a hypnotic effect about him. But he rose through the ranks and kept on getting positions of influence. He trained, as Klaus Schwab has described, Maurice Strong as his mentor, the guy who became the front man for the World Economic Forum. Maurice Strong was a co-founder and co-director of the World Economic Forum. I think he had more power than Klaus Schwab did. The same year, 1971, when he was heading the UN's first conference on population, that began to codify a new set of priorities for international policy and energy policy, specifically around the idea of population control as something for the greater good. So the idea of beginning to offer handouts to Bangladeshis in order for them to sterilize their women or to do things like that in Africa, that became something that you would have been horrified to think that was being done before Maurice Strong began to make his changes. And then afterwards, somehow it became more normalized. And Henry Kissinger, people have probably seen his NSSM 200, National Security Study Memorandum 200, where he calls for basically encouraging a policy of depopulation for target nations that want industrial progress, but they're not allowed because that would create a population crisis. They would start using the resources under their land, but that's obviously in America's interest to stop communism, so we can't allow that. Um, so that's Kissinger's NSSM 200. But again, very much in alignment with Maurice Strong's program, and I think in many ways you can call him the founding father of the Green New Deal. Um, Over the ensuing years, he found himself like the head of Petro Canada. You know, he was working very closely with. He actually was the vice president of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature under Prince Philip, the same guy who said how much he wants to be reincarnated as a deadly virus to solve overpopulation. That same Prince Philip was the president of the WWF, as Strong was his vice president. Again, spreading the gospel of or weaponizing environmentalism. So environmentalism no longer became protect nature; it became um, use the protection of nature in order to prevent poor countries or any country from developing their nations. And so that became weaponized, as so many good things become weaponized. And yeah, like at a certain point, he oversaw the Rio conference that set up the Earth Charter. He was working always with Stephen Rockefeller at creating the Earth Charter. They co-wrote it together with Mikhail Gorbachev to sort of supplant or replace the UN Charter by getting across that nations shouldn't play a role in world affairs. Everything should be based upon protecting Gaia, protecting the nature from nations. So people can read that. That was the big Agenda 21 is what he formulated at the coming out of the Rio conference, which essentially called for an eco privatization of agriculture, around a whole new paradigm of benevolent dictatorship of corporate enlightened elites that would somehow control the levers of food production and consumption. That later on got rebranded into the Agenda 2030 program that's advanced by the same elites at or wannabe elites at Davos, or the Bilderberger group that he was also, I think he was a steering committee member of the Bilderberger group. I could be wrong. Maybe he was just a member. But Kissinger was steering committee. Um, so yeah, Maurice Strong was just kind of everywhere. He ran Ontario Hydro under Bob Rae in the 90s. And while he was in charge of Ontario Hydro, this guy who oversaw the creation of the nuclear moratorium in Canada in 1980, while he was heading Petro Canada, he also oversaw the creation of a nuclear moratorium that got endorsed by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that stopped all new builds of nuclear power reactors. So he oversaw that. He made a name for himself as the enemy of nuclear power. And then he's installed by Bob Rae, a Rhodes Scholar, to become the head of Ontario Hydro, which he annihilates. He like works hard to just like pull out everything and shuts down like half of the reactors, fires their engineers, and it takes Ontario Hydro a long time to recover to rebuild from the destruction that Maurice Strong did. And finally, he's sucked into he gets caught as part of a corrupt deal for oil for food, um, with certain figures at the UN. He's in charge of the World Bank for a period. He's the undersecretary at the UN, and he oversees this oil for food deal. Turns out he's pocketing a lot of it himself, and he's got this big territory in Baca Grande, under basically owns most of the Ogallala aquifer. So he has this giant weird commune that he set up in the 80s with his wife, a weird witch, like a priestess. And they have like this commune where international cults come and set up their headquarters in the Baca Grande in Colorado, which is again totally Maurice Strong's territory. And he owns so most of the fresh water of the Ogallala. It's a strange thing. People should look into it. So after this scandal, he has to go to jail, but he avoids going to jail by going to China. And he lives out the last 15 years of his life trying to infiltrate and infuse his anti-growth agenda into brainwashing members of the Chinese intelligentsia. I think he was overall isolated and didn't have that much impact, but he had a bit of impact. He did some damage in China. And then he died in 2015. Yeah, now he's somewhere more sulfurous, I guess.
All right, so can you now, again, we're going to stick to this kind of timeline that trying to go through. 1967, concept of permanent development. Richard Romer's 1967 proposal of a mid-Canada development corridor, right? This concept comes in, and then you go all the way to 2017. You have a Canadian Senate study that actually talks about this to a degree. Can you talk about this permanent development concept and, really how it could revitalize and produce growth and development in especially the central areas of Canada, the prairies, that really could be properly sustainable, a vision to the future.
Yeah, I was shocked to find this thing. And this is 1967. Richard Romer, war hero. He's commissioned to come up with like a study, a vision for how to practically open up the north of Canada in a serious way, the way Diefenbaker had tried and failed. He's assigned to do it, to come up with, and the study is still available as a PDF online with beautiful graphs, and he basically does what he can as far as having a very small team and of doing an assessment of what are the resources, especially along the Canadian Shield, um, and he comes up with a strategy for how 'cause that's like I mentioned, 90% of the Canadian population is locked up right hugging the U.S. border. Very few live. I think maybe 6% live within the Canadian Shield, and then 3.5% live in the Arctic, above that. So highly underdeveloped. And they call for building a 4,700-kilometer rail line from the Maritimes all the way up through British Columbia and through the territories. That would probably, he doesn't have it connect to Alaska, but that would be obvious. You don't want to do that. Um, yeah, and he has different roads to rail programs. It's just really, really forward thinking. Now, unfortunately, Richard Romer's designs, I think it was at a time when it was still uncertain whether the world would continue on the pro-growth paradigm that people like Robert Kennedy was pushing towards, and Charles de Gaulle, was still in power. There were still a lot of real high quality statesmen thinking about continuing the FDR JFK spirit. And so it wasn't certain that that could be sabotaged as effectively as it was sabotaged with the ouster of de Gaulle, the murder of Bobby Kennedy, I would say the murder of Daniel Johnson Sr. in 1968. Um, I think he was poisoned. I've seen enough evidence for that. Anyway, but so if you couldn't sabotage that dynamic by creating, this new type of consumer economy, then what pathways were available? And he was assigned to sort of come up with a pathway to keep pace with the pro development USA. And he was disappointed that Pierre Elliott Trudeau heard him out and then wanted nothing to do with it, because Trudeau was committed to the post-industrial system. That was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's ideological commitment as a Fabian and as somebody who was part of the machinery. Um, so it was revived. It was, I guess, rediscovered by some senators in, I'm forgetting the name of the key guy who spearheaded this in the early 2000s. It's not, it'll come to me later, but it's in the booklet. It was spearheaded and revived and updated with new information about the terrain. And you know, I think it's another complementary. Oh yeah, it was then brought up again by a team from the University of Calgary, I believe, who did an update on this study involving now high-speed rail that they incorporated into their calculus, not just conventional rail like Romer had put forth. And it's a great updated study in 2016. Again, people can download it. I've got a reference to it in my report, and read it. It would, I think, if we're gonna make it into the 21st century, we have to talk about these sorts of things and act accordingly.
What I appreciate about your work is this vision. I very much reject this idea of degrowth, and I think, China is possibly the greatest proof of the foolishness of that theory. You can have growth, and it can be an ecologically sustainable kind of growth. Now, in terms of high-speed rail, again, it's a kind of personal thing for me. I've taken high-speed rail actually in China, and I've experienced how fast it is. It's utterly incredible. It's utterly incredible. I've taken the Via Rail up from I believe it was Toronto to Ottawa before, but it's nowhere as fast, and it's honestly just as expensive as a, much farther, much more efficient, much faster trip. I remember, I think I was in Changsha for that time, and that's where I took the high speed rail back to, Hong Kong. And I remember being in a facility. It was as as vast and as tall as an airport. It was an incredible facility. It stunned me in terms of the staggering size. It made like the Pearson Airport feel like small and miniature by comparison. And it was even for just in one city, not like not the biggest of big cities, not a Beijing, not a Shanghai. And so this high-speed rail is a very personal thing for me. And it speaks to another area where Canada and China, I believe, we probably both believe, could cooperate because China has over 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. Imagine what, could supercharge the Canadian economy other than high-speed rail from coast to coast.
It's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. And I was at a conference but with the vice president of Via Rail in 2016 or 2017. And he was going through like a presentation of possibilities of standard gauge rail, like regular rail, not high speed, that could feasibly be built by 2035 between like Quebec to Montreal to Windsor and Toronto. And I was like, wait a minute. I've read about this years ago, and this was originally being discussed in the 70s. Like, why aren't we? And I cited at the time, I was like, China has 25,000 kilometers of high speed rail. That's 2017. Now it's 40,000, right? I was like, they got 25,000 kilometers of high speed rail, and they did this all in like 15 years. Why aren't we even talking about this if we're saying that we're more advanced than China? And his logic to me, his answer, get this. He said, well, that's okay for China because they are not they didn't develop yet. But because we already developed, we hit our maximum growth decades ago. We don't need that. They need it because they're not developed. And so there's this weird assumption that you could just stop technological progress when you achieve some arbitrary moment that somebody decided is like the limit of all you're allowed, and then all you're allowed to do is use obsolete technology, if anything, from this point forward. It's absurd. Like no nation which is fit to survive thinks that way. You're always thinking about getting better. Like China's now thinking and doing magnetic levitation rail. They have the only like commercial magnetic levitation rail in the world, and they're building up several other magnetic levitation systems as then preparing the groundwork for the next logical, you know, leap outside that goes beyond even what high speed rail can do. So it's like that's a society that's fit to survive. Like that's how we used to think. And what this guy said, who's in charge of Via Rail, which is still using like obsolete 1960s tech, it's embarrassing. It's a shame.
So, can you talk about nuclear fission and why you see it as so crucial to a Canadian economic revival?
Yeah, well, I think it's one of the most efficient. I mean, for a number of reasons. I think the quality of energy that you get from especially third and fourth generation reactors, pebble bed reactors, ideally would be great. Uh, you know, we even have a lot of thorium. Like Canada has a lot of uranium. We have a lot of thorium and a lot of uranium. I think we're like the fourth biggest uranium mining country in the world. But and only Ontario has commercial nuclear power. Half of Ontario's power comes from nuclear. But it was all built up in the 70s and stopped in the 80s. It's there's nothing new that's been built since Maurice Strong's nuclear moratorium was put down. In Quebec, where we used to have three reactors, now we have zero. They've all been shut down. So I think on the one hand, the quality of energy is reliable. It gives you high density that's highly controllable. So if you don't need as much, you don't need to like draw it from the reactor. So high controllability from how much goes and disperses to the grid. Um, there's the energy flux density of the energy that comes out of it is super appropriate for industrial activity. So if you want to like melt industrial steel, or there's three types of uses for energy. It's not all the same thing. So your residential use, your transportation use, and your industrial use are three different categories of energy. And you can have like a society that uses windmills and solar panels, especially solar panels, that are fine, totally okay for residential use, where we don't need to, have industrial steel melting to build, infrastructure and rail and other things. You don't need to do that for your house. You need your fridge and your stove and your air conditioner working. And so there's a place for that. And that's how China is using their like solar energy. They don't. have the confusion that we in the West have, thinking that you can have your machine tool sector sustained by windmills and solar panels. So it has a place. But nuclear, if you're going to have a pro-industrial society, you need to have nuclear as well as something that's going to be building like the type of big infrastructure that I've been alluding to. Number two, I think it puts you for the mind work, like the cultural excellence that is demanded upon a society that is creating, utilizing, and improving upon nuclear science is of a cognitively immensely high level. You have to have such intelligent people and engineers and technicians and pure scientists working together in a very reciprocal way, which means, again, very high level cognition is required, much more so cognitively than a society that's purely on coal or natural gas. Like those things do take intellectual powers. It's very hard to manage a rig, to have pipelines. It's not a simple process, but it's still like you're not tapping into an understanding of the universe and its hidden laws that we have yet to discover in as efficient a way as you are when you're working with the atom. It gets you closer to things like fusion, which Quebec was a world leader in plasma, in tokamaks and in fusion research in the 90s. We were winning awards. And as soon as we won like the award for the most advanced, effective tokamak in the world, they canceled it. They gave us the award, and then they canceled it, shut it all down, broke into pieces like they did for Avro Arrow, and put the pieces into a warehouse that is nobody's ever seen from again. So it's like if you're gonna have practically viable fusion, you need to go through the like you can't just learn to run right away. You gotta walk first. So the walking phase is of the capacity building is learning fission properly, how to use it, how to again third, fourth generation molten salt. I referenced thorium is abundant in Canada, but we don't have a thorium reactor because decades ago the decision was made to go for reactors that produce weapon grade uranium because Cold War and thorium doesn't produce that, so they chose to cancel their prototypes that were practically already built in the 60s to have thorium reactors. Today, China is the only country that has a working molten salt thorium reactor, meltdown proof. Um, so there's, and again, third and fourth generation reactors are meltdown proof as well. Frankly, you can't they don't have the problems that the first and second generation reactors had. You could close the fuel cycle too. Like, I mean, if you're not wasting money, then we can go back and look at the science that was being put online that was actually done. The science is done. It's just that the Trilateral Commission, which Maurice Strong was a member of, and Kissinger and Zbigniew and James Schlesinger, who ran U.S. energy policy in the 70s, they canceled under Carter the closing of the fuel cycle. So instead, if you can't recycle, reprocess spent fuel, all that was left is just bury it, which again fed into the fear of people who became anti-nuclear, thinking that, oh, see, all we can do with spent fuel is bury it for a million years, right? Which was never a real argument. That was done because it was sabotage. We can close the fuel cycle. So there's all sorts of really amazing creative ways to make breakthroughs to sustain high quality life for human beings and improve nature with atomic power. And it gets us closer, like I said, to fusion, which is really the key is to get commercially viable fusion. All of these things make it a very advisable thing, I would say, for any society that wants to think long term and to grow. They should have nuclear.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing, which is that it's quite interesting that you mentioned Maurice Strong as a Canadian being on the American Trilateral Commission. But that's another thing for another time, I suspect. But in terms of China, they have, I believe it's over 50 nuclear reactors, from what I can tell. And there's these Western mainstream media stories. Now, these are it's claims, but they're claiming that China is building a big nuclear fusion facility near the city of Mianyang. That's the claim. I'm not sure what you know about that, but there's a claim about that. It's quite interesting. But
Hmm.
alas, we don't have infinite amount of time. So I want to talk about overall, like just the bigger scale of things, because if people have made it to this point, Canvas audience, thank you so much, because this is a long interview, but it's worth it. So, what major economic opportunities do you see that could drive development in Canada outside of what you've already mentioned?
I mean, there's a number of, I mean, we hit the big ones. Like these were the mega projects in my mind that are the most strategically relevant and important. Touch on these things. Now, obviously, in my report, there's other things that can be that I do draw upon and people can look at, and I'd like to build like a repository even of projects that either were built that were allowed to atrophy or that have been ideas that are viable, workable, that like I mentioned this Arctic project of the Grays Bay Road and Port project in the high Arctic that is part of the Northern Trade Corridors Fund. These are really inspiring ideas, and we should have like a repository of these to really get an audit and an assessment of what our potential is and what we can bring to the table as part of a cooperating, trustworthy partner state working with the multipolar alliance in a new architecture of economics and security. I guess the one thing that, since I'm really hitting at the theme of breaking out of the limits to growth, we've tapped into a variety of limits on the surface of the Earth, as well as in the microcosm of the structure of the atom that we've alluded to. Um, Also, I would say we would want to go back to the nuclear fusion paradigm of the 70s when we weren't putting all of our eggs into simply one tokamak basket. The idea back then was, there's so many different pathways that could be explored, but it costs money to help scientists build the prototypes that they need to test their ideas, and that money has been withheld over since the 70s especially. So a lot of great minds have demoralized, have just sort of rotted away in the West and died sad. And the new generation is trained mostly on computer modeling, which is a big problem because computer modeling has its place. But if you think that's all you have to work with, then you won't make discoveries in physical reality that do not abide by the rules of the binary computer systems that you're playing with. So like stellarators, VPIN, like so devices that use the natural uh like there's a natural hydrodynamics within fluid dynamics of plasmas, plasma being the fourth state of matter. And plasma, when it moves and its motion is controlled by usually high intensity magnets. It has a natural geometry to the motion, kind of like when you look at water flowing, through a river. There's little vortices, there's little currents that are intelligible. Da Vinci was exploring things like that. That could also help us get an insight into shock waves that create waves that create tsunamis. There's certain like there's boundary conditions. And so a lot of scientists who are really potent minded creative scientists were all looking at like how do you organize with very, very geometrically arranged magnets, plasmas that will create inches that will induce like fusion to occur that otherwise would be done with very low intensity, very inexpensive relatively, instead of just simply smashing things together in giant tokamaks that nobody seems to have a clear idea how you could create with all of that heat. How do you create or that fusion that you'll begin to you're fusing light elements to become heavy elements, and some of that matter is turned into energy that, but they don't know how to apply that to do work. So those are things that we should be looking at. China, I know, they're not putting all of their eggs into one tokamak basket. They've got a much more wide spectrum of thinking, which is great. I know they've broken records for sustained plasmas that are capable of generating fusions. Records, significant ones that China's broken. But space, I would say also, Elon Musk is making the idea of space travel and mining other celestial bodies. He's making that a kind of cool idea, but I don't trust Elon Musk at all. I think he's a frontman for a military industrial intelligence complex. And so there's a right and a wrong reason to do these things, to go and build the Arctic. It's not always the right thing to do. If your intention is to extend Mackinder's geopolitics into the Arctic, and maybe you're building up infrastructure, but you're also doing it in order to have a missile shield to prepare for a future war to destroy your neighbors. That it's better that you didn't do it. It's better that we just didn't do that at all. Same thing for space, like space for me, if it's done for the right reasons, is one of the most precious things we could do to stimulate our imagination and our talents as a species tapping into the infinite universe to be discovered, that really it's an exciting exploration. But if you're doing it to have a Martian technate, as Elon Musk says, in order to extend geopolitical battles into space with space tech weaponry and blah 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 and fighting over resources on the moon. Like it's better that you just don't do it. So I think that the Russian China example of collaboration on building jointly a lunar base by 2030, which hopefully that's the current deadline. I hopefully that doesn't get derailed, but that's a good example of like a healthy paradigm of cooperation on win-win for space. Um, Asteroid defense, things like that. It's a great way to redirect our focus and our power from using nuclear science to destroy ourselves into looking towards, building up an understanding of the geometries of our solar system and the behavior of asteroids from different asteroid belts, the Kuiper objects as well, that sometimes do a lot of damage to life on Earth. That's why most animals that have ever existed aren't here anymore. I think asteroids play a big role in that. So we're the only species that's ever existed that could feasibly identify future asteroid impact and then do something preventatively about that before it kills, with the type of power from the atom. So like we should be, I think the Russians and the Chinese would be much more enthusiastic to have discussions about the future on those things than fighting over jurisdictions over who's going to control the new world order, like they so yeah, that would be the last domain I think to be touched upon. And it doesn't play a big role in my booklet, but it's a very big role in my mind.
Very fascinating. Okay, so to end things off, if Canada continues to regretfully focus on warmongering rather than economic cooperation with Russia, China, and the global South as a whole, what would you see Canada's future looking like in the next few years?
If we continue on the bad path, mm, mm, well, yeah, it's a bit of a downer to end on. But yeah, no, it could get really dark, man. It could get really bad. Like I've studied dark ages in my work, and dark ages are not fun. Like we're on the cusp of a major systemic blowout of like a lot of the supply chains, a lot of the things we take for granted in our current world, we shouldn't take them for granted. They will come undone, and scarcity the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time in all of our lifetimes is going to be thrust upon us as chaos spreads with the meltdown of the banks. Um, if this isn't mitigated first by nation states acting like sovereign nation states in defense of their people, which could be done. It was done by FDR in the early 30s of breaking up the banks, putting them through bankruptcy reorganization in defense of the people's interests. So there's ways of doing that, like bringing back Glass-Steagall, bringing back the Canadian Four Pillars. That would also involve an audited debt jubilee of the unpayable debts that are illegitimate. Um, so like there's things that can be done, but if those aren't done as you're saying, and we stay on the stupid path, um, we're gonna be ripped to shreds. It's gonna get so dark and bad. And I mean, looking at possibility, if the U.S. is remains under the control of the current batch of ideologues that seem to be rebranding MAGA around or infiltrating what I think is the more legitimate part of the US patriotic movement, but infusing like Mark Rubio, neocons, ide- Christian Zionist ideologues like Hegseth, who wants to reconstruct, the kingdom of Jerusalem after a period of purgative violence that he believes is ordained by revelation. And he actually gave a speech talking about the need to rebuild Solomon's temple for the third time to usher in some sort of a new dispensation or whatever. So to the degree that ideas like that are moving us, that also see China especially as an enemy that must be destroyed in Iran, and that Canada plays into that. Um, Oh, it's going to be a really dark future. I really don't want that. That would be bad for all of humanity. So I'm not going to go into detail, but it can get really scary.
All right, well, obviously it's not a fun question to end off with, but I think these are the kind of things we have to talk about as much
Yeah.
as we can talk and dream about a future of better cooperation. Well, folks, Canifal's audience, we've made it. Thank you very much. Now, Matthew Ehret's pamphlet, the booklet, now it is called Canada's Potential Eurasian Future, a Vision for the 21st Century and Beyond. There's a new release of it for 2025, and certainly I would recommend you folks give this a read. I'll absolutely be linking it down below. So, Mr. Ehret, now how can people keep an eye on your work? How can they check up with it?
Sure, yeah, and thanks for plugging the book. The booklet, it's only 100 pages, so I don't want people to get their hopes up that it's a real book. It's a booklet, but it's good. They can go to CanadianPatriot.org is my primary geopolitical website, and they'll also find all of my other books, the Untold History of Canada books, the Clash of the Two America books, the Science Unshackled books. I also just released a trilogy of books called The Revenge of the Mystery Cults, going into the deeper cult subterfuge underlying a lot of the geopolitical machinations throughout our last 2,000 years. So that was a fun intellectual exercise, and that's all available on CanadianPatriot.org. Also, RisingTideFoundation.net is a fun, more educational platform I created with my wife Cynthia, who's she's a fantastic researcher as well, and I encourage people to check out her stuff. Lastly, I just launched with the American University in Moscow a new initiative called the Academy for International Cooperation with Dr. Edward Lazansky. And so we've been hosting roundtables. We're trying to build up more of a curriculum to encourage sort of a more high quality diplomatic class to emerge, capable of understanding some of the dynamics that I just went through, but a lot more than that. So that's something that people can participate in if they want to come to our roundtable sessions. Um, they can just write us an email and register and get the invites for our biweekly geopolitical roundtables.
Well, fantastic there. So, Canada Files audience, this is indeed the end of this interview, but I think we'll certainly be talking to Mr. Ehret in the near future and many further times. So, now thank you again for making it to the end of this episode of Canada Files interview. If you appreciate this journalism analysis that's done by the Canada Files, please do go ahead, set up a monthly, annual, or one-time donation. If that isn't possible, finances and situation in Canada is not good, I understand. Please simply spread the word, help it get farther. And to Mr. Ehret, one more time, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Aiden.
Goodbye, everyone. I'll see you next time.